All right, 717 this week. We're headed into celebrating the Lord's Supper before Thanksgiving, which is our annual tradition as a church. The last worship services before Thanksgiving, we always do the Lord's Supper together. So this Sunday night, 717 service, we'll do the Lord's Supper together. So come prepared for that. A few questions from this week. One via email. An individual asked me, how does a person have a sense for God's calling on their life? And that is hard because there's some mystical elements to that. Do I sense God leading me a certain way, or do I have certain gifts that because I have the gifts I should use them, or should I because someone else tells me to do something? How do I determine what God's calling on my life is? And the answer is there's about 4 things I will often encourage people to use as a measure for God's calling in their life. Number 1 is their own sense of what God is calling them to do. It is an intangible. It's not objective. People can make bad choices with that. I've had people come to me and say, God's telling me I should do something, and when they tell it to me, I just know there's no way in the world that they have the gifting or ability to do what they're telling me they want to do. So sometimes people will, we can misjudge ourselves. So that can't be the final authority, but it is a good start. What is your sense of calling for a certain thing? A job, it could be ministry in particular, like pastoring or being a student minister. Number 2 is this, is when doing activities or doing things related to that calling, do you have any joy? So if you're called to preach and you think you're called to preach and you go and teach a Sunday school class and it's miserable, preparing to teach is miserable, the teaching experience is miserable, I would say your joy factor is important. So, for instance, you say, I want to be a pastor, but you hate being around sick people. I hate to tell you, if you're going to be a pastor, you're going to have to go to hospitals and be around sick people. And if you just say, well, I don't want to do that, then your joy level is such that I'd say I would question that calling. So, number 1 is a sense of personal calling. Number 2 is a joy factor for you. Number 3 is a real consistent feedback from other people that your gifts are such that you can actually do this. So if you say, I want to pastor, but people, you need honest feedback from people you can trust, and you need to live, we all need to live in a way where we can get honest feedback from the people around us, especially those who are trustworthy people. And if that person says, man, you don't have the gift of teaching, you are putting everyone to sleep, then realize that may be your calling, but there's some things that will have to change. You can't just be where you are right now and what you're doing right now and actually fulfill this calling. So that's number 3, is the input from other trusted Christian people who love you and want what's best for you, who will be honest with you enough to say, yeah, I see some gifts here that are consistent with your calling, or who are honest enough to tell you, man, you're misreading this. You're just misreading this. You do not have the gifts for this. The 4th item is a real commitment on your part, on our part, to fulfill our calling. For instance, you say, I want to preach, I want to be a preacher, but you're unwilling to do the hard work in preparing to teach week in, week out. You're unwilling to put in the hours to get a seminary degree or to get additional training and education. Yeah, you're unwilling to go to the hospital and make visits and make phone calls and encourage people who are in need. And you just say, well, I don't want to do that stuff. I've got other things I want to do. I would say a hard work ethic toward the end of what you claim you're being called to do. So those 4 things play a big role. Number 1 is a personal sense of calling. It's an intangible thing, but just your sense. Number 2 is a sense of joy when you're doing your calling or doing things that would be related to your calling. Number 3 is the feedback from trustworthy sources around you saying, yes, I see that calling in your life. And then number 4 is the willingness to do the hard work so that you can actually fulfill this calling. Seminary degree or formal training or informal training, a willingness to work hard at the job, those kinds of things for any career, not just pastoring or ministry. This is true of any career calling. Someone who says, I want to teach school, someone who says, I want to be a fireman, someone who says, I want to be a police officer. someone who says, I want to be a doctor, all of those things are important. If you have no joy as a doctor, guess what? You're not going to be a very good doctor. So if you have no joy as a police officer, you're just not going to be a very good police officer. So those 4 things are necessary in any calling. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is if a child was baptized, but since being baptized, they think they've come to know the Lord later, should they get baptized again? The short answer to that is yes. However, I would say that every person has to come to that decision on their own, where they feel convicted to do that, where they feel like, man, I really need to bear testimony for the Lord in the form of baptism now that I am where I am in my life. I would say that that's a decision for each individual to make. But the short answer is yes, probably. And what I would do is I would ask people you trust, kind of like the situation with what's my calling in life. Should I get baptized again? Falls in that category again, which is a sense of personal conviction. Yeah, boy, I really need to get baptized since I've come to faith after that initial baptism experience. But number 2 is, what do people around me say that are trustworthy advisors? And I would get some input from them as well. And I'd love to talk to anybody who's in that situation. Okay, so that's the second question. Do I need to get baptized again if I've come to faith since an initial childhood baptism? The short answer is, I think you should. Let's talk. The third question is, does God respond to the prayers of an unsaved person? Does God respond to the prayers of an unsaved person? Say, for instance, the person's praying for financial help because they've lost their job. God, help me with this. Or there's a health issue. God, help me with that. Well, there's examples in the Bible of people praying before they got saved that God answered. And give you examples of that. Cornelius in the book of Acts is praying to the Lord, and he gets a vision of Simon Peter and sins for him, and then later becomes a believer. So there's an example of someone who had their prayers answered. I give you an example of the Old Testament. Balaam, who later is judged as an evil prophet and condemned by God because of the immorality he engages Israel in, he blesses the nation in the name of the Lord, and basically says a prayer of blessing over them. And God honors that. He sends Balaam to do that. So yeah, God will answer the prayers of unsaved people for his end and his purposes and his glory. If you say which prayers and how, you're asking the wrong person. I don't have such clairvoyance on or divine insight on when God or how God does what he does, only to say that God answers prayers of all people. He knows what they're praying. He has purposes behind why he answers yes or no, or sometimes does not answer them at all. And so I would say yes, he hears all prayers. He works through those prayers for his glory. And even an unsaved person's prayers can be answered. All right, I hope that helped with this week. We'll see you guys Sunday night.